Philosophers.
Fauxlosophers.
Well, I guess it's my turn, David, to be the one that asks the questions. And it's your turn to defend something you may or may not agree with.
Yes, although, so something that's going to be different about this time is that unlike last time in which you had to basically, okay, it sort of is and sort of isn't like last time. Last time you had to defend the status quo of copyright from my criticisms of it. But this time, since this is sort of my topic, I'm going to raise the very thing that I intend to defend instead of you coming from whatever place and giving me something to defend.
Okay. So you're just going to assert.
I have an assertion to make, yes.
And it's my job to put that assertion under scrutiny and you to defend the assertion.
Yes. So, my assertion in a bold headline-esque fashion is the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, is a necessary entity.
Okay. State your arguments. Opening arguments?
Opening arguments. Opening argument. There is one particular aspect of the FCC which I intend to assert is necessary, which is its power to regulate the usage of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Okay.
So, the electromagnetic spectrum, or specifically the part of it we care about, the radio spectrum, is one of the most powerful resources that we have at our disposal, but it is finite in quantity, but in a weird way, because of the way that radio waves propagate. So, two people can use the same frequency as long as they are sufficiently separated so as not to interfere with each other, if they want to transmit on a frequency simultaneously. Now, so what's important here is that much of the, well, okay, I can't say a proportion, but many of the luxuries that we enjoy today are as a direct result of coordination with one another about which frequencies are to be used for what and by whom.
Okay.
And so my assertion is that there needs to be some authority over the use of radio spectrum to ensure that these are not lost to people who would abuse it.
Okay. So what you're saying is, in the absence of a regulatory commission or authority, in the case specifically of electromagnetic wave spectrums that we have technology that can use, like limiting it to like things like radios and even nowadays, your GSM, your phone, for example, it operates on this.
Those are all still technically radio waves.
Exactly. They're still technically radio waves. All radio
waves.
Right,
yes. Yeah, I guess this is a technical argument, so I should go ahead and qualify what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's why I'm trying to clear up. But pretty much what I'm trying to say is I'm going to paint the analogy that the electromagnetic spectrum that we're able to take advantage of is similar to the way the literal air we're able to take advantage of through airplanes. However, it's much different than that because the electromagnetic wave is more like a pond, which we're all sending ripples out into and taking use of. And these ripples, as long as they're of different frequencies or far enough apart, won't crash into each other, causing disruptions of signal for both people. For example.
Right. We're all standing in a room together with microphones that can only pick up certain pitches, and we're coordinating which pitch everybody speaks at so that we don't interfere with one another.
Okay.
Essentially.
Now, what you're saying, I guess my first counter argument would be, or question would be, is it impossible for people to use this EM spectrum responsibly without an authority? Or is it that having the authority just grants more benefit than even the best case for random usage?
My assertion is that the authority is necessary for obstacles like people who would intentionally jam signals or misappropriately use certain parts of the spectrum which would render important services impossible to maintain.
For example, if I were to have my home theater system on the same bandwidth as the normal telephone communication, and I was just using it to broadcast loud music across my house, anyone within a certain vicinity of my home would not be able to use their cell phone because they would just pick up my loud noise coming through it.
Right, and furthermore, another thing that the FCC regulates is what power levels can be used on what bands. So, if you could have a transmitter of sufficiently weak power to run your home theater system such that it really wouldn't interfere with your neighbors. You could contain it within that room. But you could also make one that could basically wipe out communications for the entire town.
But I would be able to get my music streamed to me from wherever.
Right.
I'm still not seeing the problem. Okay. I see where you're coming from, and I think that I'm understanding the limitations of your argument as far as what scope you're talking about. Okay, so it's necessary to do those things. I guess my first question, again, I'll kind of reiterate it to fall back into scope. In the event that the FCC was absent and there was no authority, according to this argument, you would say that these types of interference or abuse, intentional jamming, personal use in inappropriate ways that aren't coordinated, or those who have the capability to purchase significantly powerful enough amplifiers and broadcasters could just take advantage and overwrite others, for example, that would be almost a guarantee.
Right, and there's actually history for this as well. So just after the advent of the of radio, actually, not just radio, but the super heterodyne receiver. Are you familiar with?
No.
Okay, so the first receivers that were able to pick out, actually I think there was one right before the super heterodyne, but anyway, they can pick out specific frequencies and listen to them, and not like broad spectrum receivers. When those came out, one of the first types of communications which was made illegal was the spark gap transmitter, which was the first type of radio transmitter, which is exactly what it sounds like, a gap in which a spark is sent, which creates electromagnetic radiation all over the spectrum, and interferes very badly with finely tuned receivers, which are listening for a particular frequency, because of course it gets into those frequencies as well. So as soon as those receivers and transmitters of sufficiently narrow bandwidth were made so that lots of people could communicate in very narrow bandwidth at once, the people who were still using spark gap transmitters were immediately a nuisance and had to be gotten rid of, because otherwise they basically completely took over the entire radio spectrum for themselves and took that ability to communicate away from everybody else who was cooperating nicely.
Okay.
And so we then there are, of course, analogies we can draw to today's communication, which is a whole lot more sophisticated, obviously.
Sure, but I think that what you said is fine. Okay. So this is a problem that we are privileged to have due to technology. This is not a problem we had before. Like,
Correct.
for instance, spark gap transmitters were fine.
When there were only spark gap transmitters.
Yeah. Now that, and in your specific example, we've increased our technological capability, and with that, old technology got in the way, so we needed to force people to update. My next question would be, is could there be a technological solution to this problem that would render the FCC useless? Or are we physically bound by the laws of physics to always have this problem?
Maybe, and it depends on which problem. So, if we're talking about signal jammers and things like that, there might be technological means to negotiate those. But let's take, for example, someone with an obscenely powerful transmitter. Okay, so there's a phenomenon in receiver technology called desensitization, in which when there is a strong enough radio frequency signal physically nearby, it will deafen the receiver to all frequencies except for that one, except for the loud, I'll call it, signal. And there's a similar phenomenon in visual optics. You notice it whenever someone shines a bright light in your eye, how everything else gets dark except for the one light that is hitting your retina. The same thing happens with radio receivers, where only that signal can be received. And so, in the absence of some authority to come down on those who abuse powerful transmitters, even somebody who's not necessarily trying to interfere will interfere if they have a powerful enough transmitter.
Okay. I guess what I'm thinking about in the scope of technologies to solve the problem, if I could come up with the technology, then it wouldn't be a problem. But I think that's the main issue, is you can't necessarily predict what technologies are going to be available. Like, I think those who were using spark gap transmitters didn't think that heterodyne transmitters receivers would ever become a thing. Like, it wasn't conceived of necessarily. However, for example, I'm going to take your light analogy and try to backwards come up with a sun type technology. There is a naturally occurring phenomenon that does this to us all the time. The sun is an obscenely powerful light source, for example, and it occurs in nature. Well, we have come up with ways to circumnavigate this, the cheapest of which being sunglasses or maybe a hat, Is there a way are we physically limited from creating something like that in the realm of in the realm of electromagnetic waves? Could there be a way that we could put on polarized blockers for certain signals, like a two-stage receiver that detects the initial or feedback receiver that detects the initial incoming wave, attunes out to cancel a wave, and then adjust for it? Or is this something that occurs in physics, that no, you can't go out and change the physics to make this work, but is there a way within physics we can solve this problem? Possibly.
Okay. I don't know if there is a way in physics that we could fix this possibly.
When I say within physics, I mean within the laws of physics. I'm not
right,
talking about...
I know what you mean.
Okay.
So
I'm not suggesting we change physics.
Of course. I only know the radio technology, not necessarily the underlying physics that might make it possible to improve it. So basically, the methods I know in which engineers try to mitigate this is either with direct RF shielding, which you don't necessarily want, because that's basically like your dumb sunglasses that aren't polarized.
Well, it's like wearing black pieces of paper over your eyes.
Right. So that doesn't work as far as fixing that problem. The other is polarized receiving already exists in the form of straight wire antennas. It basically works the same way as polarized sunglasses. Whichever way the wire is oriented, it will receive light that is polarized in that direction. So everyone's already doing this, basically. And then on top of that, RF filtering circuitry on board the receiver. This is used all over the place. And various types of filters are how our receivers are able to pick out frequencies as well as they can already. The problem is that I believe that when the receiving antenna becomes so overwhelmed with RF from an offending signal that basically it saturates the conductor in a way that the other signal, the desired signal, becomes overpowered and you can't hear it anymore.
Well, I don't want to get too technical into it, since I don't I would say that neither of us are fully qualified to maybe say
Probably
whether
not.
or not. And I'm sure there will be some out there who are, that if they heard this would immediately object and say, well, you see, no, this is why, and they would be right to do so.
We can talk in hypotheticals.
But we can talk in hypotheticals. And that's what I'm trying to figure out, because I find with, like in our last example, what it appears is happening is that we are enforcing policies on people because it's easier than doing the hard stuff and moving forward to find the technological solution, for example. And because we can do that, there is, I would argue, less of a motivation to come up with the technological solution to the problem because, well, what we're doing now can be perceived as good enough. And for me, I acknowledge the problem. I will say that you definitely, the problem you've laid out as to why the FCC is necessary, so you say, exists. This is not one of those cases where this is a non-issue. This exists for no reason. And I'm sure there are some capacities of the FCC that exist for a bad reason, but this specific censorship and so on and so forth. But this specific issue, I can see definitely is an actual issue. So what I would be curious to know is, say we value human freedom greater than, what is reasonable for us to do together, technologically speaking.
Okay.
And we, out of a sense of principle, disbanded the FCC anyway, because even though I acknowledge your problem, and I acknowledge that that was a solution to the specific problem, in the broader scope, it's worse for the offense to human. The offense of restricting freedom is worse, and so I would rather have the problem, even though it might be perceived as more difficult in the moment, and allow things go toward the future. Do you think? And that's why I asked: are we bound by physics for this problem or not? Because I can understand more if we were bound by physics that this is just how it is and it's always going to be this way. There's nothing we can do to change this instance. This is going to be how it is. I'm sorry, you can't break physics. Then I think it would have more of a leg to stand on as far as, well, we enforce a human limitation because it's a physical limitation of reality. And I think it would fall more along the same lines of people, of saying that, no one's at fault for a tornado coming into your home and blowing it down. We're also not at fault for how the laws of physics affect our ability to communicate. And of course, you can always go at one more scope and say, well, maybe this type of communication is stupid and we need to do something else. For example, using light. It's a technology, for example, that we're working with more these days. Or I call it wireless light, which is a bad name for it, because we've been using light to communicate for a long time. But I'm talking about technologically, you've had fiber optic for a while, which is shooting light through a glass cable. But now you have things that literally pulse high-frequency light out into the air, and it's diffused, which gives it its range, but it's able to be received by, and similar to the way IR is, infrared, which is commonly what you'd find in your TV remotes, that little clear bulb-looking thing on the end, that's infrared. It's like that, but on a much higher frequency, and you can communicate a lot more information that way in a small area. And it's being talked about as a replacement for Wi-Fi or wireless fidelity, which operates on radio waves, for example. So I would have to say I don't find the FCC necessary in the same way. Even though I acknowledge the problem, and I don't think you would necessarily disagree with this, because it's not really challenging. I think your argument is fine.
Actually, I do have an objection.
Okay.
So this is a technical objection that IR, in a physical sense, is the same as RF.
It is.
Infrared is the same as radio frequency. except for the frequency. That's the only thing that's changed. And so the reason why IR works and is not currently susceptible to interference the way that radio is because no one is using a powerful IR transmitter or light. They're not using powerful light. In the same way that your wireless router, your wireless access point, is using a weak transmitter on the order of milliwatts, because that's enough to cover your house or whatever space you're trying to cover. The reason why your neighbor's Wi-Fi doesn't step on yours is because it's using a weak transmitter.
Okay. Well, okay, I'll take it even further then to a different way that I think might explain it. How many frequencies exist on the EM spectrum?
A lot.
Is it a lot or is it infinite?
I don't know.
Okay.
I think current understanding of physics does say that it's finite, although, and it definitely becomes finite in the sense that once you get sufficiently high frequency, now we have ionizing radiation, which kills us, so we don't want to use it.
Sure. I would understand now when this is my new gamma ray transmitter. It is a death ray, but I use it to get
videos,
get the game, just or to get my memes delivered. It's literal radioactive memes. But what I'm talking about is, okay, 60 hertz is in the United States the frequency we use for power.
AC power. Mm-hmm.
AC power, yes. Okay. In the UK, they use 50 hertz. In some parts of Europe, I think most of Europe, they use 50 hertz, for example. These are just arbitrarily chosen. Okay. We designate, in a similar way, bandwidths for just arbitrary, between this point and this point, for this is your, what we would call classic radio, which is you tune in your car to a radio station near you, or a syndicated radio station, or whatever. And then you have your telephone or your TV antenna, which is pulling video over the airwaves, and then you have your CBs, and which is what truckers use, and we have these various bands we all lay out. Can you define one of those ranges for me, just so I can have an example? Like what's a bandwidth range or a frequency range that exists by the FCC standards? Do you have one off the top of your head, or I can use an arbitrary one? It doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to use a realistic example.
Yes, I can use one. So the FRS band, which is the band that's used by your common like Walmart walkie-talkies, is in between. So there's for sake of simplicity, we'll use one subband, which is in between 462 and 463 megahertz.
Okay, so 462 million hertz and 463. 463.
Yeah.
So there's 1 million.
1 million hertz, and it doesn't even take up the full bandwidth there.
Right. There are 1 million round number hertz.
Mm-hmm.
What if I was at 53 and a half? Or I'm sorry, 52 and a half. 52.
Okay. So this is
subdivisional bands.
Yes. So here's the time where we need to talk about bandwidth. That yes, you can keep dividing and dividing frequencies, but in order to carry information, you must use a certain subband, which is taken up entirely by your signal, and this correlates with how quickly you can transmit information, or with what quality you can transmit information. For instance, there exist different protocols for sending images over the air. So you could send, say, what's called, let's take your standard like analog TV signal. No one uses this anymore, but I think that takes like 6 megahertz for one TV channel, from the original standard of like NTSC video. So that gets us like 30 frames a second ish, and I forget what resolution is used for it, but anyway, a small resolution. Or I could send you a really big picture, but take a few minutes to do it using slow scan television and only use about 3 kilohertz. So on the order of 1,000 or 2,000 times smaller bandwidth. It just depends on how quickly I want to send information to you. So the thing about, say, the FRS band is that, yes, within it you can keep subdividing and subdividing frequencies, but every one of your channels that you would like to communicate on is a few kilohertz wide.
Okay. What about a market solution to the problem? For example, you say one of the biggest glaring problems I see is bullies with big transmitters, right? Say I'm a wealthy individual and I'm able to afford such huge transmitters, and I'm going to do that. Well, you don't like that because I'm just playing whatever music I want for my Bluetooth headset, but I want my Bluetooth to be nationwide. And so I buy a super and powerful Bluetooth, grossly offensively large Bluetooth transmitter and just broadcast that crap all over the place, right?
Okay, well,
for example,
we need not argue about proportions, but anyway, go ahead.
Sure, it doesn't matter.
The analogy holds even if we get past the technical problems of that. Yeah.
Okay, so I do that, and I'm an individual, and I do that, and I'm free to do that. We'll say the FCC. We will go with my original scenario in which we've
abolished the FCC.
Yes, because even though we acknowledge it solves this problem, you shouldn't solve the problem by forcing people to do something. So we do that. I could foresee a market demand being generated to take advantage of the situation. For example, where you go, well, I don't have the money to purchase a obscenely large something to combat on that level. However, me plus 1 million people could. If I could start a company, go into debt, and take the loan out to do that, I could create a network of these transmitters large enough to do this and compete with him on that level of intensity.
Okay.
And then what I would do then is receive from local transmitting stations low power transmissions and then schedule them like traffic and sub out my massive bandwidth to facilitate that. So for example, your clientele could dial in with a certain code. They buzz in and tell you, oh, I'm this, I pay your subscription, here's my thing, and you're like, all right, cool. I'm just going to repeat your message back on my much larger, for my much larger hardware and get it out to where you want and schedule it that way.
Okay. Good plan, depending on the details.
Well, and I'm open to whatever details make it work at this point, because in this point, I'm in the mind of the entrepreneur, and I want this to work because I have a reason.
The reason why I say it depends on the details is, RF is not entirely harmless. It's non-ionizing radiation, which means it won't give you cancer, but it does heat your body tissue. In fact, this is exactly how a microwave oven works. It's literally just a radio transmitter trapped inside of a box.
Cool.
Yes. This is what's important about power levels, is that your Wi-Fi router operating on the order of milliwatts is not going to hurt you because it can never heat up your tissue fast enough to burn you, even if you hold the antenna. Whereas your microwave oven, in a matter of seconds, will cook you alive because it's operating on the order of a kilowatt or more.
Sometimes less, but still, point aside.
Sure. So this offender who is broadcasting his tunes at a very high power level, it depends on, suppose hypothetically the worst case scenario where he is transmitting at such a high power that it verges right on the edge of danger to human life, but doesn't quite cross the threshold where we can now come down on him for killing people or severely hurting people.
Right.
And now this entrepreneur brings in his competing transmitter and does bring the level of radiation over the threshold.
Well, in that case, you wouldn't want to do that because if I were the entrepreneur, I wouldn't want to do that because hurting people is not going to be the solution.
We're not solving the problem by hurting people.
Right. But, for example, okay, another thing that makes this a complicated problem is this is a physical problem. Like, location matters. And this is why it's kind of astounding that the FCC even is able to regulate the way it does, because, for example, you can violate FCC rules if you're out in the middle of nowhere because no one's there to hear it and no one cares. It's like it's like doing illegal drugs in the...
You can violate FCC rules here in the city, no problem, as long as you don't do it in a particularly
heinous way that
Right.
makes people notice. You know?
Well, you have people who will use certain radio devices which are on licensed radio services without a license, and they probably won't get caught doing it.
Right. But for this person who's abusing what we would call abuse, from the eyes of the FCC, it would definitely be abuse. If I'm the competitor, I don't want to fall in the same pitfall. However, there are ways of blocking this, and it exists in a physical space. His antenna exists in one place. He owns, you would assume, land or rents land somewhere to do this and build this technology. You could bubble him off if you needed to. You could jam him out if you needed to. And I could bundle that as a part of my services. Because there's no one regulating me from jamming him, I could jam him back. And you create a scenario in which I have to be responsible to a majority of people because I'm relying on that funding from them. Because, most of the time, a considerable number of people will be able to generate resources on a greater order than an individual. And I know that there will be people saying, yeah, but the ultra-wealthy. Well, the ultra-wealthy make money because people work for them to make things that they can then sell to make a profit. Yeah, Amazon would stop existing if no one worked for Amazon. Jeff Bezos wouldn't be that wealthy if people said, I'm not working for you for less than $20 an hour. Everybody. He would have to find that creates his own problem. And it also wouldn't be, probably wouldn't exist on the same way as, say, a bunch of other people get together and say, I'm going to compete with Amazon to provide a better solution because we think they're abusing us for doing what they're doing. I feel there is a market answer to this problem that could be brought to bear, and it would be brought to bear by people willingly as opposed to those who would bring it about through force, direct force from authority. For example, I would have no problem if everyone in the world just agreed that we should all just use radios this way, and we're going to call it the FCC. If that were the way it was, I would have no problem with it, because people would be voluntarily doing it.
Right. So my assertion is that
people won't volunteer for that.
People will not cooperate this reliably.
Yes, and we could make arguments over whether or not people would cooperate that way. But the answer to that problem would be the market, because there's no better force, I would argue, that gets people to cooperate than the free market. Because the free market brings you cheap pencils, that no single person could come figure out a way to make a pencil to where they could sell it for literally pennies and make money, even though it's made from a wealth of materials and stuff like that. So I think we could solve that same problem via the market if you're the offender, and we've already established you would have to be some order of magnitude wealthy enough to afford this technology, right? I don't think this would ever be a problem caused by your average everyday user necessarily. Even if it was, though,
Well, I guess this technology may only be as expensive as a microwave oven in some cases.
True. But if the technology to cause the problem is as expensive as a microwave oven, then you create market forces that would strive to create the answer to that problem for the same price, at least, or close enough, I also would lean on the assertion that I know I'm going to have to defend at some point, that human beings aren't dicks by default. I know there would probably be many who disagree with me and say that no, human beings are pretty terrible by default. You have to force them to behave.
No, I'm not necessarily arguing from there. So.
I'm not trying to castigate your argument in that way, but I do think in order for me to make the argument against your point that this is a solvable problem because less than half of the population will be trying to
cares to step on everybody else this way.
Exactly. So I do kind of have to preface with that. I think this is an example of where, and it's a tough example, but you would have to trust the market to solve it. And there's no denying, let me go back. And there's no way of saying that this will be the solution. Like, building other things that operate within this physical realm to solve the problem. That might not be the case. The market we don't know how the market will answer the problem, but it will find a solution. And oftentimes it will find the cheapest solution, or most bang for your buck solution if it's entirely unregulated. We may find that there's another physical quality that exists that's different than EM or electromagnetic waves that we could take advantage of for communication. And we're going to develop that because that's cheaper, and it exists in such a physical way that it can't be corrupted like this. And we're going to pursue that research. And we're doing it because if this research turns up anything useful, we could get paid. It's useful research.
Sure, if you could obsolete radio, that would be the greatest technological advancement in the last couple centuries.
Exactly. And right now there's no need to do that. And I'm not saying that we should encourage absolutely every modicum of competition like that. But I think the amount of resources that would be freely given to solve a problem scales with the direness of the problem or the impact of the problem. This would be a huge problem if we got rid of the FCC and people began behaving in a way that, and I think they would. I think there would definitely be people that would abuse the system. I agree with that. But those people would be the reason others would go out and willingly give their money or invest their money. You're not necessarily having to give it away, but invest their money to find a solution. And this solution would be better than radio, as it exists now.
Right.
And that's where I come from in saying that while I agree with your premise, because your premise is pretty airtight, the FCC is necessary because of this in this scenario. The FCC is necessary because we don't have a solution. And we've not come up with one. I think the real way we could solve the problem and make your argument faulty is to circumvent this problem technologically.
I guess my problem with that response is that I think that your hypothesis here of a possible solution depends on discovering some new aspect of physics that we don't know to be there.
Possibly, and that's the problem, because we've had the similar discussion before about climate change, for example. You can't bet on it's not always a safe bet to say there's just a better way. I don't know. I can't say that there's always a better way to do something, because we are bound by physics. We're bound by reality to what we can do. So, and you don't know what the next thing's going to be, or if there's going to be an
or if we really have figured it all out. Yeah.
Right, you don't know.
Probably haven't.
We probably haven't. And I would go even further to say that I don't think that human beings, so long as there are human beings, will ever figure it all out. Arguing from the mediocrity of humanity, in the grand scheme of reality. But I think, and this is my techno-optimist coming out, to be totally honest, because I am a techno-optimist. I believe that technology can solve any conceivable problem we have now. And that the limit of what technology is able to solve is so far beyond the realm of comprehension for us that it shouldn't even be bothered with, because by the time we get to those problems, humans will probably have stopped doing the thinking anyway, because our biggest physical limitation, our own selves, will be insufficient to tackle these problems. We will have to create engines that can tackle these problems, or artificial ways of tackling these problems, because we would never have been able to conceive of them otherwise. So, but
of course, that's a bold assertion in and of itself that needs defending at some other time.
I think it does too, but and it's hard. I need to do more research, honestly, into this, because I don't want to say that this is what I believe just because I feel like it's right. And I could point to life experiences and say that, oh, well, I think this is true because I've observed it to be true so far, which is not always the best argument for why something should happen. or what is going to keep happening as a prediction. But that I think that's where you solve this problem. And I will concede that, to be rationally honest, if we are so bound by physics and reality that there is no way we can technology our way out of this problem, then yes, it is necessary. Because while we can't change physics, we can encourage and discourage human behavior. For sure. Because we've done it. So I will say that the FCC is necessary conditionally that there isn't a better technological problem.
So absent a sufficient technological improvement,
The FCC would be necessary.
some authority over the use of electromagnetic spectrum is necessary.
Yes.
Okay.
And I think that goes for a lot of things we would call up like this. Like, because there are several agencies that exist like the FCC, and there are a multitude of authorities that exist that supposedly are only supposed to strictly govern one area of technology. Because that's what this is, It is and it isn't. It's weird because the FCC is a lot like the Coast Guard in a way, too. It patrols a physical space. It's just not one that we often travel through.
Right, we don't think of it as a physical space.
But it is, and
It
it is.
Well, it's a very strange one as well, because as we already said, sometimes things can coexist in the same space, in the EM space, or sometimes they can't. Sometimes they step on each other.
Right. And I don't know enough about the technology either to really comment a whole lot, because you could get into talking about what about directional radio waves? Do they always propagate radially in space, or can you make them only go in one direction? Can you point them?
You can make them go mostly in one direction.
Right.
That's how your old TV antennas worked. That's why they have that sort of triangle shape. That's the direction that they're listening on, and they're not listening in any other direction. And if you were to transmit on such an antenna, you'd get the reverse, where it would transmit in that one direction primarily.
Right. But then you get into, I think you could even find your way into talking about EM space similar to the way we speak about land. You own from the ground to X number of feet above your house, and then above that, there is literal airspace that is geometrically defined ownership, where, you can't broadcast here because your waves are trespassing on my airspace, for example. This lane should be available to me only, which is a really weird thing to think about,
See, but then you get into some weird stuff like, okay, high frequency and medium frequency, and maybe even low frequency and below RF waves behave weirdly with the atmosphere in such a way that they will literally reflect off of the atmosphere and then back to Earth, and then back to the atmosphere, and then back to Earth over and over. And
sometimes on purpose, like that's what
yes,
you want.
well, yeah, that's exactly, yeah. So a lot of people do this on purpose. Medium wave and shortwave broadcast stations do this. They intend for their signal to get out far. Certain radio services exist which rely on this property of radio waves. And so, but the thing is that there's basically no way to control just whose quote unquote airspace your waves are going to propagate through, because you're just sending it up into the atmosphere. It's going to bounce somewhere and you don't know where or how many times.
Sure, but that's also kind of like saying, if I cook something really smelly, I don't know where it's going to end up or waft to, but I'm still responsible for that smell. And it's not my neighbor's problem that they smell it. It's my problem because I created it. And so I'm responsible for ensuring it, to give a really terrible, admittedly, counterexample. But you would force the responsibility back down on those broadcasters to have to figure out a way to make that only happen a certain way. And if you want that signal to, and there, I think, while that would, because I'm trying to think of a solution that could be implemented within the same framework of allowing for people to be able to do whatever they want, but creating, wave trespassing as a thing where it's like, my radio's broken. Someone's trespassing on my radio frequencies. I got to pull my receiver out and figure out who it is, and then go over and knock on the door and be like, "Hey, man, your waves are trespassing on my lawn or my airwaves. Stop it. You're being aggressive towards me.
Get off my land." Okay, sorry, that's my pun for the day.
Yeah. Get off my land.
Oh dear.
That needs to be a sign. Anyway.
You know, lawn is an anagram of WLAN.
No, it's not. Oh, okay, it is an anagram.
Yes.
Sorry. For a second, I thought, for some reason, I tied intentionalness to that, and I was like,
No.
But that's an even harder problem.
Yeah. I don't even know if that's really a better solution anyway.
I wouldn't think that it is, but I'm trying to think of a solution that would exist within the framework because the main crux of my argument is that people should be free to do whatever they want, and that's why the FCC shouldn't exist. And that's the counter argument to the FCC is necessary. I have to prove that the saying it's not necessary is like saying, okay, well, how would this work then? What would be the solution? Well, what I proposed, even though it's egregiously difficult to think about and to even probably nearly impossible to implement, that works within the same framework. It's just, but does it practically work? It's like, sorry, you can't use your radio. Why? Because you can't fine-tune your broadcast enough.
Well, right, and the thing is, especially with HF and MF, is that someone literally from the other side of the planet could be quote-unquote trespassing on your airspace. How are you going to bring down the hammer on them for trespassing? This is not, I'm just going to go walk down the street and knock on this guy's door and say, hey, cut that out. You're not going to do that. You're not going to walk over to Australia and tell the guy, hey, turn your transmitter off. You're interfering.
Exactly. And it could quickly devolve into, well, you and your buddies are all going to point your transmitters in his direction and mess with him now, and you get people being petty over the waves, and it's a spiral effect where people are causing more problems.
It's like, well, yeah, and even if you could coordinate that, how many other hundreds or thousands of people are you now stepping on in the process of trying that? Because guess what? It takes more than one hop to do that.
Yeah.
So you're gonna have to come down on somebody else at the same time.
Exactly. So. It's weird because it's like imagine having to build roads in the same way that you broadcast waves. It's very similar, honestly, when you start thinking about it. It's like, sorry, why is this road here? I don't know. It has to be, because I'm trying to get the road over there. It's like, why'd you take this path? This is the only one I had, or it's the best one I had. And I don't know. It's a terrible solution, to be honest, but I do think I would crux more on the technological advancement argument and the market solution of, well, if you were being that person, if you're being that guy, you would be generating a demand for someone to come out there and hamper your efforts, And I think that if you were a person who wanted to take advantage and use this physical space of the EM spectrum responsibly, or in a way that is honest enough that most people would agree that this is a good reason to be using it for, like communicating, not just gobbledygooking over it, we agree we want to use it for that too. So we're all going to pool our resources and find a way to allow us to do that and shut others out. It's one of those things where it's not, because originally I was going to make an argument that, it's like the internet, if you don't like that someone has a page, well, go to a different one. Make your own. If you don't like a service, create your own. But it's different because the internet doesn't exist it does exist within a physical space, but not really. It's much farther removed from that. You can buy more physical space, and the cap on that, while physical, is ludicrously huge. We have enough natural resources to create a personal internet for every person. In size and scope, we have the resources to do that. It would be nearly infeasible, I think, but you can't do that with EM. You can't do that with radio. There are physical limitations here. I think that's all I had to say about it, really. I think the market could provide a better answer, but I do think that there's an interesting nugget to be discussed in there, and that's techno-optimism. And I think that I would need to do a devil's advocate defending techno-optimism and that would be interesting. I would defend that point, not ironically. So I don't know if it'd even be a devil's advocate. It would just be an advocate. So I think we should schedule that talk for another time.
Okay, let's do it.
And I think the outcome of that discussion kind of would determine your answer, or would determine a third-party listener's answer on this. Is that, how do you feel about market and techno-optimism as far as its ability to solve problems in this way? Because if you think that it can, then, why regulate it? Just let it go, and something better will come about that'll be better for everybody. So, all right. Well, I think that's all I have to say on it.
Fauxlosophers.
Fauxlosophers.